Mr. Birling, and Mr. Birling is, I guess, presented as the opposite to Gould. And my question really is, are there any redeeming features about Birling, or is he just this kind of figure we're immediately supposed to take a dislike to?
I think with Mr. Birling, he isn't as clever as he thinks he is. And I think, as far as redeeming features go, I feel like that he isn't as bad as I think Sybil is, because Sybil seems calculated and manipulative, while he just seems a bit unaware of himself and also how he is in social situations. And he is aware of his effect on people, because obviously he sacks Edith Smith. But he does seem to have some guilt over it, while I don't believe Sybil does. Sybil only really cares when it affects her son and herself. Or Mr. Birling, he does say, "Oh, come now, Sybil," when she says she doesn't feel any guilt at all, and it was her fault. He does speak to his wife and says, "Oh," and she's normally the one that reprimands him. So I think there is something there about him.
But is that not a reputation
ignorance,
thing, in that he's kind of more savvy and aware and knows that doesn't sound good?
Yeah.
She's saying, "I don't feel bad, this girl's dead."
Yeah,
whereas
that's true.
he's kind of aware enough of the world to think that, no, you don't say that. You might think it, but you don't say it out loud.
Yeah.
All of the redeeming features are then ruined by the fact that actually underneath what seems like a redeeming feature, like his affection for his family, all actually then comes down to how it looks and the reputation of the family. So you think, oh, well, he does care about his family. Then you go, well, actually, what he cares about is how his family looks.
Yeah.
But
he doesn't care about Eric emotionally. He just cares that Eric's done something that could ruin the reputation of the family.
Even when he finds out about Sybil, he says, well, Sybil, this does look bad. It really is that air of appearance and how that.
I think he exploits his family, because he kind of sells his daughter all for business, doesn't he, to the Croft family. Yeah. And I think he exploits women generally, because obviously the women that work in his factory, he's paying them a pittance, and he's sort of taking advantage of the fact that they are women, and that he can do this to them. So I do think he exploits people. So yeah, it's more about the appearance of caring rather than actually caring. I think he's more calculated than first appears.
Yeah.
You see, I find there's a vulnerability to him, really. I think, first of all, it's interesting that in the domestic sphere particularly, he's kind of second to his wife. His wife puts him in his place. And I don't know if that's just a reflection of kind of the values of the time, or whether that's supposed to be symbolic of the fact that actually, in terms of status, he's very fragile, he's very vulnerable, he's very aware of where he is. And you can see how even Gerald, who's younger than him, he kind of sort of bends and bows towards Gerald, doesn't he? Because Gerald is,
I think you're right. Yeah, because I think that's I think what we forget, and by no means am I a fan of Mr. Birling, but what we forget is, quite early on we're told he is provincial in his speech. We are aware that he is from a lower status to the one that he now sits in, and that actually the irony is that Sybil married lower than her status when she married Birling. So I think that Birling falls into this trap of somebody who knows that they don't belong and is peddling really fast. And we see this with the length of his speeches, but these speeches that are full of absolute twaddle, to try and look like he belongs. But he doesn't belong, does he? And that's so evident. And what he doesn't see is this fact that actually what he's doing is making himself stick out like a sore thumb. Even the way he dresses, even the description of him in that full regalia of the white tie and tails for this not informal family dinner, but certainly by no means does it need the full regalia of the white tails. Makes him look foolish in the eyes of Priestley and the audience, but he doesn't belong, and he's obviously had to do something in his past to work to get there. So by no means am I saying that that's a redeeming feature. I think that sometimes we forget that he has done that to get to where he is at the moment, and that perhaps in a way I suppose that goes against him even more, because he can he has straddled that divide between the classes, the working classes and the higher classes, perhaps, and could have been more sympathetic.
I was going to say,
I don't really know where I'm going with this. I'm just trying to say that,
but like piggybacking on
we
that,
forget things about him, don't we?
Argue that everything he does is to keep that situation.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
he's just afraid of
he
could lose it.
Protecting the factory, yes, selling Sheila, but kind of selling her up. So it's almost like he isn't protecting this generation, but he is trying to secure things for future generations. Yeah. Like his grandchildren will have a better life than his children, and he's sorting out this education for Eric so that Eric isn't going to have. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? It's kind of it's setting things up so that they're not going to go backwards; they're going to go forwards.
Yeah. But do you think that he thinks that much forward in terms of like grandchildren and children? I think he's purely thinking of himself.
I think he is thinking of himself, but I also think that he's got to have a certain amount of forward thinking to be, as Miss Grant said, kind of to work your way up. There's got to be a certain amount of you that's like, no, I'm not going back, and I'm going to do anything I can to not go back. And he clearly has a work ethic. And I think you've got to think also times of reputation, and everything was so set then that he'd have to be thinking forward. Everything they do has a knock-on effect. You can't just live in the moment.
Well, he's the pure kind of it's like with capitalism. He is the exception that proves the rule exists. So he is the working class boy that's worked his way up, and so he knows how unstable that position is, and that it could all just go. And so it's like Mr. Layton says, that there is a vulnerability to him, that he knows that he could lose it quicker than he's built it. And so everything is just this desperate attempt to regain his position within society by cementing the relationship between Sheila and Gerald and making sure that Eric doesn't ruin things. But in doing that, he kind of forgets to be a dad. So he's the head of the family, but he's not really a father figure.
I think that's what those father figures were in.
Yeah.
A good father was just leading the family and keeping them on the straight and narrow. It wasn't about all love and affection, and that wasn't how they saw it in England. So I think he was just
he was an appropriate father for the time. That's what fathers did, was to work to move the family forward and to offer a safe and secure environment for that family to grow and prosper. But certainly by no means was there any paternal feeling sort of advocated and expressed.
Yeah.
And I think
we're modernised, aren't we? But at the time, I mean, he's a great dad.
And I think
but now he's not.
I think you can extend that in terms of the way he conducts his business as well, because when he says something like, I have a duty to keep labour costs down, doesn't he, as his kind of justification for not paying his workers sufficient wages. And I think our first reaction is to go, oh, that's terrible, what a terrible man, he should pay everybody equal wages. But look at your own life, look at the clothes you're wearing, look at your mobile phones. They're all cheap goods, and they're cheap goods because somewhere along the line somebody's not being paid enough. And that's kind of the expectation of capitalism, isn't it? Is that you do have this duty so that a certain group of people can afford to buy goods. It's just that you have to do that. You have to sacrifice your compassion for the most poor. Yeah. And so, I think I judge Birling quite harshly, but actually, his way of looking at the world is the one that we have, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, it's cool. It's putting value over having the next nicest phone and cheap but nice clothes. It's putting that over the lives of people that are in these factories that are working for less than pennies in horrible conditions to kind of to keep with the status quo. Which is, I think, it's why it's still such relevant text today, is because these things still happen. Because they're not happening in this country as much, people seem to think it doesn't happen anymore.
And that's why it's interesting. We laugh at Birling when we see him as this appalling man.
Yeah.
But all the things we've said is that he's kind of he's obsessed with his status. He wants to keep the status quo as it is. You know, he looks at things practically, but not with compassion. That's kind of what we're guilty of, that, aren't we? In the way that we look at the world. So, you know, I think maybe we've misjudged him, but we need to kind of use Birling as a way to look at ourselves, I think.
Yeah, well, I was going to say it's all, but so if we look at it that way, then Priestley's making a comment on how ridiculous we think, because I suppose a lot of people in the audience will actually be very much like Birling in their belief for capitalism, their role as a father, and you know, if that was taken just as, they could totally and utterly empathise and see themselves as Mr. Birling, but then Priestley undercuts that traditional role of the father by making him seem ridiculous in those opening scenes with that use of dramatic irony to say, okay, if you see yourself as Mr. Birling, I'm going to undercut that. I'm going to make him look ridiculous with, you know, his inability to predict the future in terms of the Titanic and war, and therefore you need to look at yourself if you see yourself in
even in the opening stage directions. Yeah. There is hints and clues, isn't there, to this facade that is being put on, and I think Priestley is trying to open the audience to that by saying things like, I think, is it cozy but not home-like, when he describes the family home. You know, that's suggestive of something isn't right. You know, it's all about looks. It looks right, but underneath it all, there is no homely feeling. There is no comfort from within that. And I think that's what you're saying, Miss Jackson, there is we need to be aware of the, you know, that's this inner reflection on what our own, as an audience, what our own lives are like and what we are classing as important and what we are projecting to the outside world versus what's actually going on at the heart of that family.
Because also I think we're very guilty with the spectacles of always looking at it from our time perspective, whereas the audience at the time, like, that would have been their dad. Mr. Birling would be their father. And so I think you have to, with Priestley's message of wanting things to change and wanting things to go forward, the audience has to recognise Mr. Birling and empathise with Mr. Birling in some way. Because if you don't empathise with somebody and you don't recognise that within yourself, you don't change. You're just like, oh, that's somebody else. That's not me. So no change happens. So I think that sometimes we distance ourselves from it too much as a modern audience and ignore that connection that they would have to Mr. Birling and Mrs. Birling, who we as a modern audience just hate. There would be, I think, be some kind of understanding of the more of the audience of the time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think they use the 1912 setting and the changes that happened between 1912 and 1945 to really emphasise that fact of you might recognise that person, but a lot has changed in between then and now. Even and that's obviously much more so in 1945 than it is for us now, because that's kind of more distant.
And when we think contextually, we have to remember as well that Mr. and Mrs. Birling, although we're stepping foot into the Edwardian era, they will have been brought up very much as a Victorian family, wouldn't they? So this idea of that coldness and that lack of maternal and paternal emotion will have been ingrained into them, and it's a very difficult transition between the Victorian and the Edwardian. And as we move forward through to 1945 and the way that the world changed so much, is, you know, people are going to be reflecting on that in the audience as well, aren't they? You know, the way the world has changed vastly. That's why context is so important with this play, isn't it?
Definitely.
But again, I suppose the critique is that from Priestley is that they are just that kind of inability to change completely is just wrong to him. Like the fact that, you know, even Gerald, who would be considered part of the younger generation in many respects, his inbuilt, you know, aristocracy breeding just does not allow him to change. And, you know, I think that, yes, they are kind of have been brought up in a certain way, but I suppose it's that idea that I'm trying to think of a quote.
But it's forced change though, isn't it? Because when you think about Birling's final, you know, it's not even words, is it? It's just stage directions. The final line, guiltily and dumbfoundedly, I think, is the line from the very last moment of the play in Act 3 when he's taking the phone call. You know, those two words, you know, guiltily, there's your emotion, there's your realization. That's him being forced to change. Priestley is showing, isn't he, that no matter who you are, where you are, how you've been brought up, your ideals, the world will force you to change. You know, and dumbfoundedly, I think, is the realization that there is nothing he can say or do. This is his world now, and it is going to crumble and crash around his ears.
See, I think that's probably what Priestley meant. I think that's probably Priestley's message. But looking at as a modern audience, that's not what happened. And I think you can read a kind of cynicism into some of that play, because, you know, look at the way that this character justifies himself and self-validates, you know, throughout the play. And even, you know, there are some moments where he does feel genuine sympathy for what happens to Eva. But he puts it down. I tried to write it down. He said it turned out unfortunately, and that's all. And that to me is a really telling line, because, you know, he's saying that this is bad luck. This is, you know, a chance happening of fate, and there's nothing much you can do about it. It's just unfortunate that some people are poor. It's just unfortunate that some women are used by men. So there isn't really any sense, is there, that what's happened in the play isn't a result of bad luck. It's the result of deliberate choices and the way that society has been organised. Yeah. And I don't even think Sheila gets that. I don't even get that sense from her, that anything's going to change. She ends the play with that decision whether to take the ring or not. But there's no sense of, I'm not quite sure which way she would go. And so, you know, I'm sure that Priestley was very optimistic about what happened, but I can't help reading that level of kind of pessimism in it as well.
You could read that.
Actually, nothing has changed. Women are still exploited. Mm-hmm. There are still far too many poor people in the world. The ruling classes are still the rich. Nothing has changed.
Yeah, and I was going to say, literally, Gerald's a good example of that nothing changes for him really. He's almost comes out of it very kind of, not blameless, but he comes out of it quite easily when he's done just as much as anyone else, really. And it is
even the inspector,
they're untouchable.
Yeah, I was going to say, even the inspector gives Gerald an out to feel less guilty than other people, which again is irritating. Just actually making me really depressed now, because you're absolutely right. Looking at it from here, nothing really has changed.
It's almost as if we've gone backwards.
Yes,
isn't it?
What a joyous message for a Wednesday morning.
There's still people abusing their power now, just as they were then. Mr. Birling's a character that abuses his power. When the inspector comes to visit, you know, he tries to, you know, talk about golf and playing golf with the chief constable and try and use his position to intimidate the inspector. He's trying to use that position to intimidate others, and that still happens now. People are still abusing their power nowadays. So yeah, like you say, nothing's changed really.
Yeah, it's like we said before, that it reflects us, because he told us this story about how unfair society is years ago, and even then we were like, wow, yeah, this is amazing, yeah, we should change, and nothing has. And it's like, how many times do we need to keep hearing the same story, thinking, yeah, that's awful, before we actually do anything? But again, it's reflecting, as we said before, how deeply ingrained capitalism is within society, and that we know things are unfair, but we still want the phone anyway. We still want the cheap clothes anyway.
Yeah, it's become more of a hidden, isn't it? We've just tucked it away so we don't have to look at it quite so much.
And you think, you know, as long as you're aware of it, that's fine. You know, as long as you know that it's bad, but it's not enough to know. It's, you know, we need to actually act and do something about it, rather than be aware of it.
We're being run by a world of Primark, aren't we? And that kind of idealism, rather than a world like, and this is showing my age, a world of Star Trek, where money doesn't exist and we work for the good of it and to improve ourselves and those ideas. You know, we are being run through a world where money is power.
Yeah. Yeah, your worth is your worth.
Yeah.
Yay, capitalism.
Oink, oink.
Should we all go and vote Conservative then?
No.
I feel like we'll plug ourselves into a deep, dark hole of.
We're all just like,
There's no way back. Birling was right all along.
Yeah. But the play was written as I think it was Evie said, you know, at this time in 1945 when there was that moment when things could change, and things did change, didn't they? Because you know the NHS was born, and look how that's thriving. You know, education was reformed, and for the first time, you know, the 1950s saw really the first kind of generation of working class people, you know, going to the big universities, the main universities. So things did change for a while. There was that sort of sense of that closing of the gap, and maybe, you know, that kind of that ending of the play where it is basically saying, you know, what happens next, you decide. You know, maybe that was for the time a moment of great optimism, and it's just that in our cynical age we can no longer read it like that.
Like telling us, you know, we decide the ending because we've actually got the power to vote and to put these things in place. But it's like we say with the NHS, you know, how much everyone loves it, and yet we're all well aware that it's being defunded at a colossal rapid rate, and we're not doing anything about it. We just kind of think we're just accepting it, and it's this idea of just acceptance that, oh well, that's just how things are. And again, that goes back to Mr. Birling about how he exploits women, and oh, you know, will these things just happen? And it's the idea of being complacent makes you complicit in all of these things because you're allowing it to happen. And so I think he reflects us more than we like to think he does, because we all, you know, we ridicule him and think that he's this archetype capitalist, but as a society we've got more in common with him than we probably like to think.
I think we've seen it a lot with obviously what's happening with the pandemic as well, because there's been a lot in the press with, you know, families struggling to feed, you know, children, etc. We've seen Marcus Rashford, so we've seen that inequality even more with what's happening. And yet, like you say, if we don't actually do something about it, we're complicit in that kind of situation, aren't we? That, you know, families are struggling at the moment and it is difficult, and there is big inequality in the country. So yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
So I started this meeting depressed, and now I'm just gonna go.
We do seem to end up in a more depressing state after these conversations than we start.
I think my students always say to me as well whenever we do poetry, like, Miss, why is it always depressing? And I was like, English is depressing.
Wait until we start chatting.
It's always about death. Every single time, all roads lead back to death. Quite often with it.
We're doomed. We're all doomed.
Doomed for all time. Oh, we really should do a Christmas Carol, shouldn't we? Just so we
Yes.
No.